Hey folks, so today we're going to be doing a lesson that's going to help you with your improv, and it's all about moving between chords. But before we get going, I do want to give a shout out to my boy Robert, who runs the Facebook group Martin Guitars and Bluegrass Instruments. Definitely go check it out, lots of cool stuff. He lets me spam my YouTube videos there, so he deserves some love. Also, if you're looking for a way to support this YouTube channel, you should check out my website, lessonswithmarcel.com, for tabs, transcriptions, merch, and Skype lessons. For the folks that love freebies, more than half the tabs in the tab store are free. There's a ton of killer blog posts, and at Jazz and Grass on Instagram has more bluegrass guitar licks than you can shake a stick at. All right, that's the end of my ad. Let's talk voice leading and bluegrass breaks. So what is voice leading? Well, it has to do with how the chord tones in a chord interact with the chord tones in a neighboring chord in a chord progression. With good voice leading comes a really clear movement from chord to chord. This can help inform choices in how you voice chords in a chord progression, or how you might compose a melody over certain chords, or probably most important to us today, how you might improvise a line over a given chord change. So let's take a look at a classic set of bluegrass changes. G, C, G, D. And in order to prepare for the change repeating, another G. Each of these chords can be spelled as a triad. For instance, a G chord is built of G, B, and D. A C chord is built of C, E, and G. You may notice that I've stacked the C chord out of order. This will make sense soon. Lastly, the D chord is built of D, F sharp, and A. Placing these triads in the same order as our chord change allows us to take a more detailed look at the harmonic structure of this simple progression. Now, as we analyze each row of chord tones, we'll see one of three relationships. Most obvious are the moments where the chord tones stay the same, like when moving from G to C and back, the G chord tones remain the same. Similarly, when moving from G to D and back, the D chord tones remain static. The next movement we'll see is a whole step movement. For instance, from G to C and back, our D moves up to E and back down to D. We know these are whole steps because there is a chromatic step in between, in this case E flat or D sharp. Next, from G to D and back, our B moves down to A and back up. Once again, we can confirm the whole step distance by knowing there's a note in between B and A. That note would be B flat or A sharp. The third and final relationship is a half-step movement. For instance, from the G chord to the C chord and back, our B note moves to C and back down to B. With no possible passing tone, this is a half-step. From our G chord to our D chord and back, we get G to F sharp and back to G. Once again, no chromatic note in between, must be a half-step. So all of that music theory is great in the abstract, but we need a way to practically apply it somehow. The first thing we might look at is those half-step movements, because they feel the strongest. Let's drop in some tab, a few bar lines, and some chords, leaving 2 measures for each chord. Focusing first on moving from G to C, let's consult our chart. Our B moving to C was the half-step movement we found earlier, so let's drop that in the tab. Focusing on our G to D and back movement, we can see that F sharp to G was the strong movement, so let's drop that in. I'm going to place it at the end too, knowing that I have to get back to a G chord to finish our break. Now that we've taken advantage of voice leading in these key transitional moments, let's go back and fill in the rest of the break. Over the G chord, let's start with some minor to major third movements and fill in the second measure with some basic G major pentatonic language. Over the C chord, let's also do some minor to major third work, but use the C major pentatonic scale and minor seventh for the rest. In our next G chord, we can think the same way with some minor thirds for the first measure and pentatonic for the second. Our D measure will be D major pentatonic with a small bit of minor to major third, closing out the whole thing with a Lester flat G run. If all of that bluegrass vocabulary felt like a lot to you, then you should check out some of my bluegrass lick videos and maybe check out my improv exercises video, as well as my transforming your pentatonic scales video. Before we take a listen, notice that I didn't exploit our voice leading when moving from the first to second line. That's because I wanted to land on the root note of the G chord, and there's nothing wrong with that. We don't always have to use this technique, and frankly, I don't think the C falling into the B is as strong of a motion as B rising into C. Now with our break complete, let's take a listen. Now, that's one option, but what about the rest of this chart? Obviously, our static notes won't give us much help because they imply no movement. They don't show that the chord has changed. But our whole step movements might be another thing to exploit. Let's focus in on D moving to E over the G to C chord change, and B moving to A in the G to D chord progression. Remember earlier, I mentioned that there is a chromatic note in between these whole step movements. We'll use these to our advantage now. Moving on to our tab, let's place D, E flat, E on the seam between G and C, and B, B flat, A on the seam between our G and D chords. To fill in the rest, let's follow the same process. Maybe some classic bluegrass guitar stuff in the first measure, a little G major pentatonic in the second measure. Let's really play with those minor thirds over the C chord, and let's do a reconstructed Lester flat G run over the next G chord. D major pentatonic and minor and major third for the D chord, and our last measure will get a G run with some syncopation just for fun. Before we listen, check out how from the D chord back to the G chord, I use that half step movement of F sharp to G. All of these different things can be used in conjunction. Anyway, let's take a listen. Before we call it a day, let's take a look at some slightly more complicated harmony. So with our simple chart, we can see the relationships between each triad, but sometimes harmony is more complicated. For instance, if we change our G leading to C to a G7, and our D leading to G into a D7, we have some more voice leading opportunities. The G7 has an F in it, and the D7 has a C in it. This gives us a new half-step motion when moving between chords, but this video is already getting a little long, so if you want to experiment with that, pause the screen and stop watching some guy on YouTube play breaks and play some breaks for yourself. Remember that if you want to practice all of these things, you don't have to think about the note names necessarily. See, the guitar is laid out in a really visual way that actually helps facilitate some of these relationships. Think about moving from G to C. On the fretboard, you can find moments where the chords are leading into one another. Like right here, you don't have to be a music theory professor to see that or use it, so don't limit yourself. All right, if you like taking a lesson from the biggest, baddest Billy Goat in the barnyard, please like this video or leave a comment down below. You can subscribe to this channel. You can also check out lessonswithmarcel.com. There we got the tabs, the transcriptions, the merch, the Skype lessons. There's also the blog posts that all of our wonderful article writers write every single week, as well as all of the licks on Jazz and Grass on Instagram. There is so many. Seriously, it's wild. Anyway, I guess I'll see you guys next week on Wednesday for another Bluegrass guitar video.